They say wars are won by generals' maps and brilliant strategies. But that's a lie. In the burning deserts of North Africa, under a sun that peeled paint off steel, entire Allied columns didn't fall to German guns. They died because their fuel leaked quietly into the sand. Not from sabotage, not from enemy action, but from a single invisible engineering mistake, a flaw so small you could run your thumb across it. And yet it cost thousands of lives, entire operations, and changed the pace of the war. This is not a story about tanks or generals. It's the story of a metal can, and how the arrogance of one decision helped shape the fate of World War II. If you're watching this on WW2 Secrets, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're hearing this story. Now, let's begin. Berlin, summer of 1940, where the air itself seemed to vibrate with the hum of factories, building a war machine the world had never seen. No prelude, no calm before the storm. The city felt like a living engine, pistons pumping metal, screaming sparks, flying as Germany prepared to remake Europe in steel and fire. Amid that thunder of industry, a single man walked out of the Ambibud pressworks with something so small it disappeared in the shadow of the hulking factories, yet powerful enough to alter the fate of armies. Paul Plius, an American engineer who had lived long enough in Berlin to feel the rhythm of its machinery in his bones, clutched a 20-liter Wehrmacht fuel can to his chest. Not just any can, the can. 3 handles shaped with almost arrogant precision, a cam lever cap that sealed shut with a satisfying bite, and 2 stamped X's on its faces that looked decorative but hid an engineering genius few ever noticed. Paul had watched these cans endure every torture German engineers could conjure, slammed against concrete, frozen, until metal screamed, cooked in industrial ovens, hurled from truck beds onto stone. And every time the can survived silent, unbent, and most importantly, dry. No leaks. Not a drop lost. He couldn't say that about the flimsy containers he grew up with in the States, cans that dribbled fuel like they were trying to drain themselves to death. To Paul, the contrast was almost humiliating. The Germans had reinvented something America assumed was too simple to matter. So he made a choice. Risky, maybe reckless, but necessary. He packed multiple jerry cans along with their technical drawings and manufacturing specifications and boarded a ship for New York. His goal was simple: convince the U.S. Army that this humble steel container, this quiet miracle of design, could save millions of gallons of fuel and countless lives once America was pulled into the war everyone knew was coming. What he didn't know, as the cold Atlantic wind whipped across the deck, was that his pitch would be rejected. Not the design, not the idea, his expertise, his warning. The U.S. would keep every visible feature of the German can and destroy the one hidden detail that made it perfect. A decision that 2 years later would bleed fuel into the sands of North Africa like water through fingers. The doors of the War Department in Washington, D.C. didn't slam shut. They whispered their refusal, polite and absolute, the way bureaucracies kill great ideas. Paul walked those marble halls, carrying the jerry cans like physical proof of a truth no one wanted to hear. Officers in crisp uniforms examined the German container with detached curiosity, as if it were a souvenir rather than a survival tool. They measured the handles, traced the stamped X's with gloved fingers, weighed it, tapped it, cataloged every visible feature. But they never once asked the question that mattered. Why is it designed this way? What does it endure that ours do not? Instead, they spoke in the comfortable language of institutions, procurement cycles, manufacturing contracts, existing standards. Words meant to defend inertia. The Germans had reinvented the can. The Americans believed the can didn't need reinventing. A perfect design brought right to their doorstep, and they treated it like an inconvenience. Some whispered reasons back then sounded almost childish. Not invented here. Too complex to produce. Why change what works well enough? But Paul knew well enough would not survive the violence of a mechanized war. He tried to explain the stress tests he'd seen in Berlin, the jolting drops, the brutal heat, the freezing nights, the relentless vibration of engines across rough terrain. But he was an outsider, a lone engineer challenging a system built on tradition and hierarchy. His words evaporated in rooms where egos weighed more than evidence. Eventually, someone at Camp Holabird in Maryland agreed to take a closer look. That flicker of interest might have seemed like a victory, but it was merely the beginning of a misunderstanding so catastrophic that it would echo across deserts, thousands of miles away. The engineers studied the German brilliance with the fascination of craftsmen, and then quietly resolved to Americanize it. They would keep the shape, the X's, the handles, the cam lever, the things anyone could see. Everything visible would remain intact. Everything invisible would be changed. And with that quiet decision, the fate of Allied fuel supplies was sealed. Several years later, under a sun that burned holes through the horizon, soldiers would watch their fuel vanish, grain by grain, into the sand. Tanks would stall, convoys would choke, and men would curse the containers that betrayed them, never knowing the betrayal had begun right here in these rooms, in the soft shuffle of papers, and the polite rejection of German perfection. The heat hit Richard M. Daniel like a physical blow the moment he stepped off the transport plane in Egypt, September 1942, the kind of heat that made engines wheeze and metal burn to the touch. Daniel wasn't a soldier. He wasn't armed. He wasn't here to fight Rommel. He was a chemical engineer sent by the War Department to confirm what sounded back in Washington like exaggerated rumors, massive fuel losses across the North African theater. But the desert does not exaggerate. It strips everything down to its brutal truth. The first convoy Daniel inspected told him more than any report. He watched a British truck rattle over the dunes, the metal frame groaning to flimsy 4-gallon cans bouncing in the back. After barely 2 hours in that hellish terrain, the soldiers smelled it, the sweet, sharp scent of gasoline. They didn't even react anymore. They were used to it. The cans buckled at the seams, solder split open, heat warped the panels. The desert simply drank the fuel grain by grain, drop by drop. 30% lost before reaching the front line, sometimes 40. In one documented case out of 70,000 imperial gallons shipped forward, only 30,000 arrived. A 57% loss. And the quartermaster had the gall to call it a good effort. Daniel walked the supply yards, like a man witnessing a slow-motion catastrophe. British flimsies, thin tin cans worthy of their mocking nickname lay crumpled like discarded food tins. American cans weren't much better screw caps that jammed cork gaskets, that shriveled heavy drums that needed pumps, funnels, and 2 men struggling against gravity just to pour. Almost everything leaked. Everything wasted time. Everything wasted fuel. And fuel was life in a mechanized war. He saw soldiers fighting the cans more than the enemy cursing as they wrestled with wrenches and makeshift spouts. He saw gasoline darkening the sand in quiet damming stains. He saw the disaster not as a statistic, but as a daily wound. That night, in a cramped, sand-blown tent, Daniel wrote the cable that would shake Washington. Estimated 40% loss due to spillage and evaporation, he said. Later, he would admit the number was a provocation, a guess sharpened to inspire panic. But the desert had already confirmed the truth, whatever the exact percentage it was, enough to stall tanks in the middle of operations, enough to force convoys to carry twice the required fuel, because half would bleed away before arrival. And through all of this one detail, mocked the entire Allied effort. The Germans were not suffering the same fate. Across captured depots lay rows of green steel containers that looked almost new, unbent, uncompromised. Soldiers hoarded them. Officers requested them. Every man who touched one instinctively understood this was the container built for war. It was the first crack in a larger realization that the Allies weren't just losing fuel. They were losing to an object that Germany had perfected and America had misunderstood. Why were the Germans immune to the crisis that was bleeding the Allies dry? The question hung over every supply officer, every commander staring at his dwindling fuel logs, every mechanic watching a tank sputter to a halt. Same sun, same desert, same distances. Yet, while Allied convoys hemorrhaged gasoline into the sand, the Germans delivered theirs, intact, clean, efficient, almost elegant. The answer wasn't magic. It wasn't secret alloys or forbidden chemistry. It wasn't even classified. It was engineering, mercilessly practical, obsessively tested engineering. The British were the first to realize something didn't add up. Intelligence teams combed through captured depots and were stunned by what they found: rows of identical green containers stacked neatly, almost proudly, as if each one had survived the desert untouched. Soldiers treated them like treasure. Whenever they captured a German jerrycan, they kept it. Some traded cigarettes for them. Some hid them from their own quartermasters. A few even engraved their names on the steel, like soldiers claiming a lucky charm. But the truth behind that luck went back to 1937, long before the Desert War began, to a German engineer named Vinzenz Grünvogel at the Müller Works in Schwelm, Westphalia. The Wehrmacht wasn't impressed by pretty designs. They wanted a container that could withstand the brutality of blitzkrieg fuel that arrived late, might as well not arrive at all. So Grünvogel built what the Germans later called the Einheitskanister, the universal canister, and tested it like they intended to break it. He began with the body, two stamped steel halves, welded with electric resistance seams, pressed deep into the metal, creating strength without adding bulk. Then came the three handles, one long for a two-handed carry, or passing down a human chain too short for balance, or single-handed control. They were recessed, so cans stacked smoothly. No wobble, no wasted space. Soldiers could carry 2 full cans or 4 empties with ease. Simple, efficient human ergonomics disguised as metal. But the genius lived in the details no casual observer would ever appreciate. The cap wasn't a screw top. It was a cam lever mechanism paired with an internal breather tube. Flip or seal. One person could empty a full can in seconds. No funnels, no tools, no frustration. And then came the X-shaped indentations, stamped into both faces of the can lines that looked decorative, but performed 3 essential tasks: stiffening the metal, allowing for expansion when the gasoline heated under desert sun, and contracting again without creating vacuum pressure. The can breathed with the fuel without ever surrendering a drop. German field tests pushed the cans to their limits, frozen nights in Poland, scorching ovens simulating summer violent drops from trucks bouncing over cobblestone roads. The cans didn't break. They didn't warp. They didn't leak. By the time they were adopted in July 1937 under Order AHM 324, the jerrycan had already survived more punishment than most machines endured in a lifetime. To the German soldier, it wasn't just a fuel container. It was a quiet member of the war effort, an unseen soldier that never complained, never failed, never demanded attention. The Allies would learn this truth the hard way, sometimes. The fiercest weapons aren't guns or tanks, but the simple tools that keep them alive. Back in the United States, thousands of miles away from the rattling convoys of North Africa Camp Holabird buzzed with a quiet curiosity. Engineers gathered around the German jerrycan, like archaeologists examining an artifact from a superior civilization. They measured every contour sketched, every seam photographed, every angle. And in those early days, there was a spark of respect, even admiration for what the Germans had built. But admiration is not the same as acceptance. The American engineers decided to improve the can. Not because it needed improving, but because that was the American way: take a foreign idea, reshape it, claim ownership of it. They kept the silhouette. They kept the capacity. They kept the 3 handles, the cam lever style cap, even the X-shaped embossing, though simplified as if the elegance of the original was somehow too European, too precise. Then they made the single change that ruined everything. Where Germany used electric resistance welded seams, strong, recessed, nearly invincible, the Americans replaced them with rolled seams. A crimped fold, quick to produce, cheap to manufacture, compatible with existing machinery. On a water can, it was fine. On a gasoline can in the desert, it was engineering malpractice. Imagine a thin crease of folded metal expanding under a 120-degree sun, then shrinking in the freezing desert night. Expand, contract, expand, contract. Over and over, day after day, mile after brutal mile. Each cycle opened microscopic channels in the seam too small to see, too small to drip, but large enough for fuel to seep out relentlessly. A dark ring beneath a can, a faint smell of gasoline, a small stain in the sand. Harmless alone, catastrophic when multiplied across tens of thousands of containers. Richard M. Daniel would later put it bluntly, almost bitterly. Any petroleum engineer knows you never store gasoline in a container with rolled seams. But by then, the cans were already in production. The mistake was already soldered into Allied history, and the problems didn't stop there. Some American versions stripped out the internal breather tube, meaning fuel choked and glugged, as it poured slow, frustrating a two-man job in the middle of war. Others removed the protective lining inside, allowing fuel to corrode the steel or contaminate engines. Every shortcut, every efficiency, chipped away at the reliability the Germans had engineered so fiercely. Yet on the factory floors, the machines thundered on. Tens of thousands of these compromised cans rolled toward the ports, green, brown, olive drab, all looking deceptively sturdy, all carrying their hidden flaw like a quiet curse. When they reached North Africa, and the Pacific soldiers welcomed them as an upgrade from the British flimsies. But it didn't take long before they realized the truth: these American cans weren't German. Not even close. They leaked slower, but they leaked. And in a war where fuel was the bloodstream of every tank, truck, and plane, slow was still deadly. By late 1942, North Africa had become a graveyard of fuel dreams. Imagine a convoy at dusk. German jerry cans stacked with crisp precision American cans beside them, leaking faint halos into the sand, and British flimsies, already half-crushed before sunset. 3 armies, 3 containers, 3 different fates, and every logistics officer knew exactly which cans they trusted. German cans were set aside for urgent missions, recon runs, armored thrusts, rescue operations. American cans were assigned to secondary needs. British flimsies. They were a burden, carried only because there was nothing else. Fuel became a cruel gamble. Daytime temperatures climbed over 120 degrees, expanding the metal until seams strained and bulged. Night brought a 40-degree plunge that snapped the metal back like a whip. This daily torture cycle split seams open, widened microscopic cracks, and turned gasoline into a ghost, arriving in ever-shrinking amounts no matter how much was shipped. What should have been a straightforward supply chain turned into a bleeding artery across the desert. Then came Daniel's cable. 40% loss. Washington had ignored the early warnings from 1940. They dismissed the genius of the German design. But this was unavoidable. You could not wage mechanized war with nearly half your fuel disappearing into the earth. Tanks stalled during maneuvers. Trucks limped to the front on fumes. Commanders planned operations knowing that whatever fuel they consumed in combat, they would lose just as much to the containers meant to protect it. And so, in a twist of wartime irony, salvation came not from American factories, but from British ones. In 1943, British manufacturers began producing faithful replicas of the German jerry can. Not inspired by, not improved upon. Faithful. Welded seams exactly where they belonged. Full internal breather tubes. Protective linings that kept fuel stable under extreme heat. Every feature the Germans had perfected, copied line for line, beat for beat, because finally, someone understood that perfection didn't need re-engineering. These British-made jerry cans flooded the war effort like a long-delayed answer to a prayer. 2 million units shipped to North Africa, more queued up for the European campaign. And suddenly, Allied supply lines breathed again. In the mud of Italy, in the hedgerows of France, in the freezing forests of Belgium, the British cans endured where their American cousins faltered. Yet, The irony remained. American factories kept producing the inferior, rolled seam version, churning out flawed cans alongside the superior British ones. By VE Day, the U.S. Army alone required over 19 million jerry cans for the European theater. Across all Allied forces, more than 21 to 22 million cans circulated through the war, some perfect, some disastrous, all mixed together in a logistical soup no historian can fully untangle. And tucked within those staggering numbers were the silent losses fuel that never reached a tank, trucks, abandoned in the desert missions delayed because the very tools meant to sustain war were sabotaging it from within. The war surged forward. Rommel was pushed back. Victory in North Africa came, but not because the Allies mastered the desert. They simply stopped losing fuel to it. When the war finally ended, the world celebrated its generals, its battles, its grand strategies, but not the things that kept those armies alive. In the endless library shelves of post-war analysis, the jerry can become a footnote, a supporting character forgotten behind the noise of tanks and bombers. And yet, hidden beneath that silence, was a truth few wanted to put into official ink. Entire operations had lived or died based on a steel can the size of a suitcase. The American rolled seam disaster was never formally confessed. Reports blurred the lines. Bureaucrats buried the details in paperwork so dense it strangled accountability. Even Richard M. Daniel, who had walked through the desert watching gasoline soak the sand like spilled blood, admitted decades later that very little about the jerry can made it into the official record. His 1987 article, "The Little Can That Could," was less a technical paper and more a quiet act of historical correction. His attempt to say what wartime memos never dared to say aloud. Meanwhile, the German design lived on. It outlasted Hitler, outlasted the Reich, outlasted the very factories that forged it. The same principles Grunvogel perfected in 1937 carried into the Korean War, into Vietnam, into NATO logistics across the Cold War. By the 1980s, the standard 20-liter military fuel container used by NATO looked so similar to the original Wehrmacht design that a soldier from 1942 could pick it up and know exactly how it worked. The world kept the welded seams, kept the breather tube, kept the X-shaped reinforcement. Because the truth was simple, the Germans got it right the first time. But this is more than a technical tale. This is about the arrogance of institutions that think they can outsmart simplicity. It's about the cost of ignoring details because they're invisible on a blueprint. It's about the not-invented-here pride that blinds engineers and officers alike. A small decision, switching a weld for a rolled seam, had ripples that stretched across continents. Fuel wasted, battles strained, men stranded in deserts they never chose. And in the end, the jerry can became a symbol not of German engineering alone, but of the quiet truths war reveals. That victory isn't only won by tanks charging or planes screaming overhead. It's won by the unseen tools that keep engines turning. It's won by respecting the details that no one applauds. It's won by listening even when the messenger is a lone engineer walking out of a Berlin factory with a steel can under his arm. Today, the jerry can is still here, still stamped with its unmistakable X, still welded, still reliable, a relic that survived because it was right, because it proved that brilliance doesn't shout, it endures. And maybe that's the final lesson this humble container teaches us. In war, as in life, the smallest choices often carry the greatest weight. In the end, what strikes me most about this story isn't the engineering or the fuel losses, or even the chaos on the desert front. It's the reminder that history often turns on the smallest hinges. A welded seam, a breath tube, a quiet warning ignored. Wars are shaped by tanks and generals, yes, but also by the simple things we think don't matter, until they do. To me, the jerry can isn't just a container. It's a symbol of humility, a reminder that innovation doesn't care about borders pride or who invented what first. It just works or it doesn't, and lives depend on the difference. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. And if you'd like more forgotten truths like this, consider subscribing to WW2 Secrets. It helps us keep these overlooked pieces of history alive for the next curious mind who comes searching.